Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. A pair of manicured hands smoothed down the front of a flowing emerald dress, adjusting the neckline just so. Looking good, if I do say so myself, the figure murmured, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of ruby red lips. Just a normal guy enjoying his hobby. Nothing weird about that. But even as the words left his mouth, Mark couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt. Was this really just a harmless pastime? The hours spent carefully applying makeup, selecting the perfect accessories, practicing a more feminine gait, it all felt so natural, so right. Like slipping into a second skin he'd always been meant to wear. With a shake of his head, Mark pushed those thoughts aside. He had plans tonight, and dwelling on complicated emotions wouldn't do him any good. Grabbing a small clutch purse from the vanity, he gave himself one last appraising look in the mirror before heading out. The click of heels on hardwood echoed through the empty apartment as Mark made his way to the front door. A wave of anticipation washed over him as he stepped out into the cool evening air. Tonight was drag night at his favorite local bar, and he'd been looking forward to it all week. As he walked down the sidewalk, Mark couldn't help but notice the occasional curious glance from passers-by. But rather than feeling self-conscious, he found himself reveling in the attention. There was something thrilling about being seen as a woman, even if only for a few fleeting moments. "You've got this," he whispered to himself, squaring his shoulders and lifting his chin. "Just another night out on the town. Nothing to be nervous about." The neon sign of the Pink Flamingo came into view, casting a warm glow on the faces of the small crowd gathered outside. Mark's pace quickened, eager to join the festivities. As he approached the entrance, a familiar voice called out, "Well, well, well! Look who decided to grace us with her presence tonight!" Mark turned to see his friend Tony sauntering over, resplendent in a glittering gold jumpsuit and towering platform heels. "Darling, you look absolutely divine," Tony cooed, air-kissing Mark's cheeks. "That dress is to die for. Where on earth did you find it?" A genuine smile spread across Mark's face as he basked in the compliment. "Oh, this old thing. Just a little number I picked up at that new boutique downtown. You know how it is. A girl's got to treat herself sometimes." The ease with which the words flowed surprised even Mark himself. In moments like these, it was all too easy to forget the carefully constructed boundaries he'd set for himself. The line between hobby and identity began to blur, leaving him both exhilarated and uneasy. As they made their way inside, the thumping bass and swirling lights enveloped them. The bar was already packed, a sea of sequins and feathers as far as the eye could see. Mark felt a familiar thrill course through him. Here in this space, he could truly be himself. Or rather, he could be the version of himself he'd always longed to be. "First round's on me, sweetie," Tony declared, already flagging down a bartender. "What's your poison tonight?" Mark hesitated for a moment before answering. "You know what? I'm feeling adventurous. Surprise me with something fun and fruity." Tony raised an eyebrow, a knowing smirk playing at his lips. "Coming right up, sugar." As they waited for their drinks, Mark found his gaze drawn to the stage where a stunning queen was in the midst of a high-energy performance. Her movements were fluid and graceful, exuding a confidence that Mark couldn't help but envy. He imagined himself up there, basking in the spotlight, fully embracing the femininity that constantly simmered just beneath the surface. "Earth to Marky!" Tony's voice snapped him out of his reverie. "Your drink, madam." Mark accepted the brightly colored concoction with a grateful smile. "Thanks, hun. Cheers to another fabulous night." As they clinked glasses, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him. The carefully maintained facade of just a hobby was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of a deeper truth he wasn't quite ready to face. Hours slipped by in a blur of laughter, dancing, and increasingly uninhibited conversation. With each passing moment, Mark found himself sinking further into the persona he'd created. The distinction between performance and reality grew hazier, leaving him both exhilarated and unsettled. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that Mark finally stumbled back to his apartment, feet aching and makeup smudged. As he fumbled with his keys, a voice from behind startled him. "Have a good night out, miss." Mark turned to see his neighbor, an elderly woman he'd exchanged pleasantries with but never really gotten to know. Her expression was kind, if a bit confused. For a moment, Mark froze, unsure how to respond. The easy charm he'd wielded all night seemed to have deserted him. But then, almost of its own accord, his mouth opened and words spilled out.
"Oh, you know how it is,"
he said with a light laugh, his voice pitched higher than usual. "Girls' night out can get a bit wild sometimes, but it was lovely, thank you for asking." The woman nodded, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Well, you look beautiful, dear. Have a good rest of your night." As she disappeared back into her own apartment, Mark stood rooted to the spot, heart racing. He'd just willingly, almost eagerly, presented himself as a woman to someone who knew him in his day-to-day life. The implications of that simple interaction sent his mind reeling. Once safely inside his own space, Mark leaned against the closed door, letting out a shaky breath. He caught sight of himself in the hallway, mirror-smeared lipstick, disheveled wig, the strap of his dress slipping off one shoulder. But beneath the imperfections, he saw something else, something that made his breath catch in his throat. He saw himself, truly, authentically himself. With trembling fingers, Mark reached up to remove the wig, expecting the usual pang of disappointment as his masculine features came back into view. But this time, something was different. As he stared at his reflection, he realized that the person looking back at him wasn't just Mark in a dress. It was someone else entirely, someone who had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. "Who am I?" he whispered, tracing the contours of his face with a manicured nail. What does normal even mean anymore? The questions hung in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore. As dawn began to break, casting a soft glow through the curtains, Mark made his way to the bedroom. He carefully removed the dress, folding it with reverence before tucking it away in its designated drawer. But as he reached for his usual pajamas, he hesitated. Instead, his hand drifted to a silky nightgown he'd bought on a whim months ago but never dared to wear. With a deep breath, he slipped it over his head, relishing the cool fabric against his skin. As he crawled into bed, exhaustion finally catching up with him, Mark's mind continued to race. The boundaries he'd so carefully constructed were crumbling, leaving him both terrified and oddly liberated. He knew that when he woke up, he'd have to confront the reality of his situation. But for now, wrapped in silk and the lingering scent of perfume, he allowed himself to simply exist in this moment of clarity. Dreams came swiftly, filled with visions of a life he'd only dared to imagine in his most private thoughts. In these dreams, he moved through the world as his true self, unburdened by societal expectations or self-imposed limitations. He saw himself thriving, loved, and accepted for who he really was. When Mark finally stirred, late in the afternoon, the weight of the previous night's revelations came crashing back. He lay still for a long moment, eyes closed, trying to recapture the sense of peace he'd felt in his dreams. But reality was insistent, demanding to be acknowledged. Slowly, he pushed himself up, the nightgown pooling around his waist. His gaze fell on the vanity across the room, still cluttered with makeup and accessories from the night before. It was a sight he'd seen countless times, but today it held new significance. With a deep breath, Mark swung his legs over the side of the bed and padded over to the vanity. He sank into the chair, studying his reflection in the mirror. The remnants of last night's makeup clung stubbornly to his face, a physical reminder of the persona he'd embraced so fully. As he reached for a makeup wipe, his hand hesitated. Did he really want to erase all traces of that version of himself? The version that felt so right, so authentic. "What am I doing?" he murmured, dropping the wipe and burying his face in his hands. This isn't just a hobby anymore, is it? The admission, even spoken only to himself, felt both terrifying and liberating. For years, Mark had clung to the idea that his love of feminine clothing and expression was nothing more than an eccentric pastime, but deep down, he'd always known there was more to it. Lifting his head, Mark met his own gaze in the mirror. "I want to be a woman," he said softly, testing the words on his tongue. "I've always wanted to be a woman." The world didn't come crashing down around him. Lightning didn't strike. Instead, a sense of calm washed over him, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Of course, acknowledging this truth was only the first step on what promised to be a long and challenging journey. Questions and doubts swirled in Mark's mind. How would his friends and family react? What about his job? And the logistics of transitioning? Where would he even begin? But amidst the uncertainty, there was also a glimmer of hope. For the first time in his life, Mark felt like he was finally being honest with himself. The path ahead might be difficult, but it was his path to walk. With renewed purpose, Mark stood and made his way to the closet. He pushed past the suits and button-downs that had never felt quite right, reaching instead for the collection of dresses and skirts hidden in the back. As he ran his fingers over the soft fabrics, a small smile played at his lips. "Time to stop hiding," he whispered, pulling out a simple sundress. "Time to start living." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of research, soul-searching, and tentative steps towards a new life. Mark, who was beginning to think of herself by a different name, though she hadn't settled on one yet, spent countless hours online reading about hormone therapy, legal name changes, and the experiences of other transgender individuals. She also began to experiment more boldly with her appearance, no longer confining her feminine expression to the privacy of her home or the safety of drag nights. Small changes at first: clear nail polish, subtle makeup, androgynous clothing. But each day brought a new opportunity to align her outward appearance with her inner truth. Of course, these changes didn't go unnoticed. Curious glances from coworkers and probing questions from friends became increasingly common. Mark found herself constantly walking a tightrope, not quite ready to come out fully, but no longer able to maintain the facade of normalcy she'd hidden behind for so long. It was Tony who finally broached the subject head-on. They were having coffee at their favorite cafe, a weekly ritual that had taken on new significance as Mark navigated this period of transition. "So," Tony said, stirring his latte with exaggerated nonchalance, "are we going to talk about the elephant in the room, or should I just pretend I haven't noticed my best friend blossoming into a gorgeous butterfly right before my eyes?" Mark nearly choked on her cappuccino, caught off guard by the directness of the question. For a moment, she considered deflecting, falling back on the old excuses and reassurances, but as she met Tony's gaze, seeing nothing but warmth and acceptance there, she felt a surge of courage. I think I'm transgender," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "No, that's not quite right. I know I'm transgender. I'm a woman, Tony. I always have been. I didn't know how to admit it, even to myself." Tony reached across the table, squeezing Mark's hand. "Oh, honey, I know. I've known for a while now. I was just waiting for you to be ready to tell me." Tears welled up in Mark's eyes, a mixture of relief and gratitude overwhelming her. "You knew? And you're okay with it?" "Of course I'm okay with it," Tony exclaimed, loud enough to draw curious glances from nearby tables. Lowering his voice, he continued, "Sweetie, all I've ever wanted is for you to be happy, and I've never seen you as happy as you are when you're embracing your feminine side. If this is who you truly are, then I'm here for you 100%. The floodgates opened then, and Mark found herself pouring out everything she'd been holding back. Her fears, her hopes, the sense of finally understanding herself after years of confusion. Tony listened attentively, offering words of encouragement and the occasional tissue as needed. As their conversation wound down, Tony leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. So, have you given any thought to what you want to be called? Mark doesn't really seem to fit anymore, does it? Mark shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. I've been thinking about it, actually. What do you think about Evelyn? Eve for short? Tony's face lit up. Evelyn! Oh, I love it. It suits you perfectly, darling. And just like that, with the support of her best friend and the simple act of choosing a name that felt right, Evelyn took another step forward on her journey. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she felt truly, authentically herself. The following months brought a whirlwind of changes as Evelyn began to fully embrace her identity. She started hormone therapy, watching with a mixture of excitement and trepidation as her body slowly began to align with her inner sense of self. Each small change, softer skin, subtle curves, the redistribution of fat felt like a miracle, a physical manifestation of the woman she'd always known herself to be. Coming out to her family proved to be one of the most challenging hurdles. Her parents, while not outright rejecting her, struggled to understand. There were tense conversations, awkward silences, and more than a few tears shed on both sides. But slowly, gradually, they began to come around. The first time her mother called her Evelyn, using her chosen name without hesitation, felt like a victory beyond measure. Work presented its own set of challenges.
Evelyn was fortunate to live in a state with strong protections for transgender individuals, but that didn't make the process of transitioning in a professional environment any less daunting. She worked closely with HR to develop a transition plan, and while there were certainly awkward moments and the occasional insensitive comment, overall her colleagues were supportive. Through it all, Evelyn found strength in the community she'd begun to build around herself. Support groups, both online and in person, provided a safe space to share her experiences and learn from others who had walked this path before her. She formed close bonds with other trans women, finding solace in their shared struggles and celebrating each other's victories, no matter how small. As the months turned into a year and then 2, Evelyn's confidence grew. The person she saw in the mirror each morning was finally the person she'd always known herself to be. Gone were the days of hiding behind a facade of normalcy. Now she lived openly and authentically as the woman she truly was. Of course, life wasn't perfect. There were still moments of dysphoria, days when the weight of societal expectations and ingrained self-doubt threatened to overwhelm her. But Evelyn had learned to weather these storms, to remind herself of how far she'd come and the strength she possessed. On an evening, almost 3 years to the day since that fateful night at the Pink Flamingo, Evelyn found herself once again standing in front of her bedroom mirror. But this time, there was no costume to don, no persona to slip into. The woman staring back at her, with her softened features, gently curved figure, and eyes bright with hard-won self-assurance, was simply herself. She smoothed down the front of her dress, a deep blue number that hugged her body in all the right places. Her makeup was flawless but understated, a far cry from the elaborate drag looks of years past. This wasn't a performance, it was just Evelyn preparing for a night out with friends. As she grabbed her purse and headed for the door, Evelyn couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her to this point. The years of confusion, of trying to convince herself that her desire to be a woman was nothing more than a quirky hobby. The fear and uncertainty of those first steps towards transition, the challenges she'd faced, and the incredible support she'd found along the way. Just a normal woman, enjoying her life, Evelyn murmured to herself as she locked up her apartment. But this time, the words held no trace of self-deception or inner conflict. They were simply the truth. Her truth. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.